Have you wondered how other suppliers are navigating the tariffs challenge? Some are setting themselves up for long term supply chain success. A great example is 3M. Well, we can learn from the resilience and the brilliance of 3M on this episode of The Savvy Supplier. Welcome into The Savvy Supplier, where we save you time and money. I'm Al Frank, alongside Boyd Evert, the CEO and co founder of HRG. And Boyd, I know you remember those old E.F. Hutton commercials where they said, when E.F. Hutton talks,
People listen.
you got it. Well, right now, suppliers are listening and they want to know how best to navigate these tariffs increases. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say about one of our clients, 3M, and how they're reducing their exposure to higher tariffs. What are some of the ways that they're doing that?
Right. So I think it's the biggest method that they're using to cope with this is having multiple redundant points of fulfillment within their supply chain. We saw how devastating the pandemic COVID was on the supply chain. And some suppliers looked at it and said, never again. And they went about finding multiple points of sourcing. Others, well, we were able to get through that. It'll be another 100 years. Well, so we can go back to business as usual. So those companies that did business as usual, those are the ones that I think are in a bit of a panic right now because of the just the ground underneath their feet is constantly shifting with all of the tariff policies. And so companies like 3M that chose to essentially say, never again, we're not going to go down this path again. They went about looking for multiple points of fulfillment. And one of the things that they did, well, as other companies do, is try to locate the sourcing as close to the customer as possible. So rather than having a supply chain highly optimized for the lowest cost, you make it highly fragile because you could have parts being assembled in multiple places and then final location, but it would have incurred multiple tariffs along the way. And we've seen that in different news publications. For instance, with the iPhone, here's all of the tariffs that would roll into a typical iPhone at this moment. So I think looking at 3M's way of approaching this looks like they have really figured out the way to move forward in this environment where it's highly volatile. And I would say this, that a lot of suppliers in every category, they hate surprises, right? They want to be able to anticipate. They hate uncertainty because when you have uncertainty, eventually that works its way into the cost of goods because they could be incurring some lower prices on sourcing things, but they're not going to pass that on to their customers because they're going to set it aside and accrue for that uncertainty. And so I think what we're going to see here in this year is you're going to see fewer rollbacks, fewer events where, temporary price decline, what have you. And so it's eventually going to impact the customer. But yeah, hats off to 3M. They really were proactive and they really seemed to execute on that.
Yeah, it sounds like they were playing 3D chess and planning their moves out well in advance, maybe game planning various scenarios. Is that what they did?
Right. Companies like 3M, where they make excellent business partners, they're the ones that really will circle back with you and say, all right, what are the lessons learned? Right. Okay. So what's the root cause? What's driving this particular issue that we're having? And so they're very, very intentional about wanting to understand not just what happened, but how do we mitigate the risk of that happening again? And I think that's exactly what happened after COVID. And it put them in a really good place when the tariffs started to hit because a pandemic and a tariff war are very, very similar, right? Because you're going to have costs that are going to be incurred almost immediately, and you have to deal with that. You're going to have shortages, right? So it may be prohibitive to bring in certain material to manufacture certain items because of the tariffs so high. And so it's almost as if the sourcing country would almost have a lockdown in place like we saw during COVID. So I think that's one of the things that maybe they didn't anticipate a tariff war, but certainly they've positioned themselves to be in a place of strength and resilience.
Well, how much inventory does 3M typically have on hand? How big of a strategic advantage?
Following some of their leaders in the press, they've messaged out to the public. They try to stay around 90 days
Mm,
of inventory. So they've got a 3 month balance. And I would have to say that a lot of companies are somewhere between 30 to 90 days. It really depends. I mean, electronics, a lot of the major orders for Black Friday are manufactured after everything's negotiated, and they're manufactured at the last possible moment before they need to ship that item, because typically in electronics the prices are continuing to drop. But so in electronics, if you set that industry aside, consumer electronics, for the most part, a lot of other companies like to do that. Now, that also cuts both ways. So then you can't be, if you've got 90 days of inventory, you can't be as swift to take a price decrease when
mm.
some of the material, the costs drop around it. The other aspect of it is in just in time retailing, right? Where the orders are coming in just at the last possible moment. You have something like tariff policy come in where it's going to create uncertainty. Some retailers are going to want to buy a lot of inventory before those tariffs take effect. So that could eat into your days of inventory. But the other aspect of it is it could swing the other way. Like, we're going to really cut back on this particular item and lean into other areas where there might be some more price stability. So this might even affect the items that are carried within individual stores, your points of distribution, how many facings you have in all of the stores for a retailer. I could easily see that is reflecting the uncertainty that's in the marketplace.
Multi-sourcing can make a company more resilient. We see that in their case, but doesn't it also add more complexity, maybe some higher upfront costs as well? How do you compensate for the complexity increase?
Right. Yeah. So one of the biggest factors is quality control. Let's take another industry, clothing, rag goods. So in clothing, you have independent firms that test for colors, right? So that if a buyer is buying certain colored shirts, t-shirts, dress shirts, whatever, that has to match other items, right? And within it, so the pants matching the shirt, and so the dye, the mix of the dye, they'll have it tested separately. So if somehow one point, let's say you're sourcing out of India and maybe Cambodia, and maybe the mix of the dye is off a little bit, that stuff makes it to the store and it doesn't match other shirts. Somebody comes in, they love that shirt, they come back to buy another shirt, and here it is, it's just slightly different. That falls back to the supplier. And so that's a particular case of where comparing colors becomes a little more challenging, right? Because even if you're using cameras, it just the lighting, the exposure time, everything seems to impact color. So that's one example of quality control. I think another aspect of it, when you have changes being made, pushing those changes out, you now multiply the complexity of change management. And did we implement the changes correctly at both locations? So I think as long as everything's the same, which it never is, but if everything's the same, then there's really not much of a risk. But we know in retailing, there's always change, and there's always complexities that are entering in, maybe even unforeseen. And then that creates some friction and some additional costs because they're having to pay to correct for that.
So I guess it's important to be able to analyze it quickly and quickly make the adjustments that need to be made to maintain the quality.
Absolutely. And like one unforeseen example was we were working with a supplier around soap, detergent, dishwasher soap, that sort of thing. And they had all their product ready to be palletized, but they didn't have the label to go on the
Mm.
box or bottle. And that was extremely frustrating because they had everything else. And so, who would have thought we need to have redundancy in labeling? But during COVID, you sure needed that, because I think it was even down to the type of the color ink, right? Well, the company wants their logo to have the proper colors that it has. Otherwise, it looks like it's, like they bought it off a third party website sourced out of some other country with dubious claims to authenticity.
Because I think of 3M and I think about all the different products that they produce. It's many, many dozens, maybe even to the hundreds of different products, and the challenges that would arise. as you try and control the quality of all those products when multi-sourcing. They must have just masters of business acumen and motivation for their employees, and even a philosophical underpinning that doesn't change. What can you tell us about the kind of the culture of 3M?
The culture for 3M is one of extreme partnership. They lean into best practices. They're always wondering, is there a better way to do something? It's not just the number of products. They certainly do have a number of products. They're in so many different categories, so many
Mhm.
diverse categories. Again, looking back at COVID, they had some items that were in extreme demand, right? The N95 masks, the hand sanitizer, that sort of thing. But then maybe perhaps some of the other items, maybe the automotive items or the filters for your HVAC, that demand might not have been as strong, right? And in some cases, you could easily see them saying, we want fewer facings of band-aids so we can have more facings of your hand sanitizer. Well, if everyone's doing that, right, it's going to put extraordinary pressure on you to be able to pivot and have this huge surge in demand. I was talking to a company that makes generic hand sanitizers before COVID, and one of their frustrations were that some stores seem to pull stuff off the shelf and use it for in-store use, right inside play bathroom or in the break room or whatever, and maybe the smallest flaw to the pump, or maybe it fell on the floor. So they were having these excessive defectives. And then after COVID hit, I just was following up, asking how they were doing, and they said, we've life's never been so good,
Hmm.
right? That they had 100% sell through. And I said, what about that excessive defective? Oh, we don't have that problem anymore. Which sort of suggests maybe there was some things going on in certain stores, right, in certain locations where they were abusing it. But getting back to the 3M opportunity that they saw is that they're constantly learning that even with their forecasting, things can change quickly. 3M, as well as other clients that we work with, they see that as an opportunity to learn. They're looking at the situation and saying, okay, so now it's not only going to impact our typical forecasting, but we're going to have to update those forecasts as the facts on the ground change within the stores. So they're constantly pivoting and performing in that direction of process improvement.
Well, it's kind of amazing if you think about it. They're a Fortune 500 company, obviously, as we've been pointing out, masters of business acumen and procedure and process, and yet they're humble enough. They have the humility to seek out the help of others and learn from others. For example, HRG to help shoulder some of the burden that they face. This says a lot about who they are and even their ability to adapt and seek out help.
Yeah, it sure does. It One of the things that's unique about 3M, or not unique, but rare, is a lot of suppliers suffer from the not invented here syndrome, right? Is that that's not the way we do it here, sort of
Mm.
thing. Even if it's a great idea, they're not going to embrace it. 3M, if it's a good idea, they don't care where that idea is originally sourced, right? Who is the original proponent? If it sounds good and makes sense for their business, they're going to embrace that, right? And it's the same thing with best practices, with deductions. We've got several clients, among them at 3M. They embrace those best practices, and they pay dividends because then now you are creating an environment where it's a lot harder for an auditor coming back and looking at those transactions a year or two out. They're looking at those transactions saying, did this retailer get the best price at that time? And with the best practices that they're embracing, it makes it a lot harder for, let's say, a creative auditor to come in and look at an email or look at a proposal or agreement and somehow renegotiate that agreement 2 years after the fact. And so, with the best practices they embrace, we just don't see that happening.
So at some point during this, 3M and other companies as well realize that sometimes you have to pivot away from certain suppliers because they're in certain regions of the world that are maybe higher in tariffs. How do you go about doing that? I mean, and how long does that typically take? Seems like it would be a major, major shift.
It is a major shift, but necessity is the mother of invention. So, one particular example, not related to 3M, but it's certainly a compelling one. I read the other day in the journal that Apple is going to be able to fulfill a great number of the phones because they're sourcing it from India, but
Mhm,
those sources were initially to serve the Indian market, right? So they're robbing Peter
mhm.
to pay Paul. So then they're probably gonna have to source it from China and then incur the tariffs, right, coming in because I'm sure India has some tariffs, right, tariff policy with other nations, not just us. And so I think what you're seeing is a lot of companies that maybe took half steps. Maybe they were just focused on having the supply chain stay within the nation. And so there are enough facilities where they're manufacturing part of the product and maybe scaling out so they're making even more of that rather than pulling something in. Let's say that if they have a non-finished item coming into one country that gets a lower tariff versus a finished item coming in, maybe you end up bringing in the product at a state of semi-finished goods and then finishing it within that country. You see this with automobiles, right? A lot of the foreign cars are made in North America, most in the US, but there's some in Canada and Mexico. So, and part of that just made sense in the automotive industry because the shipping costs, right? Almost became prohibitive to build the finished car in Japan or Germany or wherever you build it here. And I think so. I think you're seeing some of that play out, but I think 3M was more intentional, saying we need a fault tolerant supply chain. We need to be anti fragile where things just aren't easily broken. And I think that's sort of the gold standard we're seeing across the board. I know that there's others doing it, but a lot of them are leveraging things that weren't intentionally designed to help cope with tariffs, but they're repurposing that solution, like Apple is leveraging the production in India. But I think you're going to see more of that. And this is one of those fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. If suppliers don't learn this time around, you need multiple points of sourcing. Then when another major event comes about, their stock is going to look extremely volatile, and they might even be part of the portfolio of a day trader.
Well, but thanks again for bringing the information to us today. I just want to remind retail suppliers that the experts at HRG are able to take a look at your particular situation and help you to get a clearer picture of what you need to do right now. You can schedule a free strategy call by going to the HRG website at hrg-audit.com, hrg-audit.com, or you can call HRG at 479 616 1600. You can email us at info at hrg-audit.com. All these different ways to reach out to us and knowing that HRG is here to help you. Our wish for you is this: wiser decisions, fewer deductions. See you next time on the Savvy Supplier.